Good day, class, and this is attorney Paler-Acasio, and I will be your professor for Law 1, Obligations and Contract. And I believe Law 1 is the first law subject for all accountancy students. So this will be an introduction to all your law subjects during your whole accountancy years. No, so obligations and contract, if you try to look at it, it starts with article 1156. Now you may ask, where is article 1? So before we go to obligations and contracts, let's look at civil code of the Philippines as a whole. So actually, obligations and contract is only part of the civil code of the Philippines. Now, the Civil Code of the Philippines is composed of 5 parts. The first part, wherein you can see Article 1, is about persons and family relations. Now, the book on persons, it deals with natural personalities and other topics about family. So it also includes although we have the family code, but it is usually incorporated in person. So that is book 1. And then book 2 covers the law on property. So the law on property, basically from the title itself, it deals with all kinds of property, whether personal or real. So later on, we will tackle or we will touch certain areas on the law on property. Now, the third book is the law on succession. When you say succession, it is the process of inheriting properties coming from the decedent or a person who had died. So that is book 3, the law on succession. Then book 4, we have obligations and contracts. So this is it's inverted. This is law on obligations and contract, book 4 of the civil code, and it is divided into 2. We have obligations and we have contracts. These two are different, but they are connected. So that's why we have to take them as one subject. And then we have book 5, we have the law on sale, partnership, and other innominate contracts. So we focus here on the law on obligations and contract. Now if you try to read the book, I'm actually using Attorney Andrex Domingo's book on obligations and contract law, principles, and jurisprudence. You may use other books, but I prefer that you use this book for easier reference, especially during our examination. So, yes, if you try to read the book, the first part, before the start of obligations and contract, it states there lawmaking. So how does a bill become a law? Now when you say bill, that is a proposed law that is enacted in Congress. So when you say Congress, that is not just the lower house or the House of Representatives. It is composed of our 2 legislative bodies. Legislative meaning lawmaking bodies. So our Congress is composed of 2 houses. We have the lower house, the House of Representatives, and the upper house, the Senate. So both these 2 bodies are co-equal branches, and they are in charge of making laws. So it states there how a bill becomes a law. So you can read it. So if you try to read it, it states there that the president has a role in lawmaking. Okay, so although lawmaking is solely in the jurisdiction of the legislature, however, the president also has a role in making laws. So let's have a quick rundown how a bill becomes a law. Now, that is as provided in Article 6, Section 27 of the 1987 Constitution. Now, a bill is introduced by any member of the House of Representatives, whom we commonly know as congressman or representative, or it may be introduced by any member of the Senate, or who we commonly know as a senator. Then it undergoes 3 readings. No? The bill undergoes 3 readings. The first reading is reading the title and the number. The second reading is the scrutiny of the bill. And that is, second reading is the most important stage of passing the bill, because this is the part where other members of the Congress may ask questions to the author about the bill that he is proposing. And then on the third stage, if it passes second reading, on the third stage, they now go to the voting of the bill. Now, how do they vote? They say aye for yes and nay for no. So that's as simple as that. Yes, it's a yes or no voting. And if you get two-thirds aye or yes votes, then the bill is then transmitted. If it comes from the House of Representatives, it is now transmitted to the Senate, and then it will undergo another 3 readings in the Senate, and on the third reading there will be a voting. Again, 2/3 yeah, it's actually yeah, not I is British. 2/3 yeah votes, then the bill the bill will now be transmitted to the president, and the president, he may do 3 things. He may sign the bill. By signing the bill, it becomes a law. He may also not do anything. So within 30 days, after 30 days from the time that the president received the bill and there was inaction, meaning why gibuhat, he did not sign, he did not disapprove or whatever, then automatically the bill becomes a law. And the third, he may veto the bill. So that is the veto power of the president. So when you say veto, he is disapproving the bill. So what happens if the bill is vetoed? Does it mean that it will not become a law? So in our principle of co-equal branches, the bill that is vetoed by the executive, by the president, is now transmitted back to its original house. And the original house may the Congress jointly may veto the bill by overturning the veto with 2/3 votes. So that is how a bill becomes a law. And of course, after the vetoing, after the signing or the inaction, the last step is it takes effect after the 15-day publication. So all laws are to be published. Okay, so let's go to obligations and contracts. So that's quite a long introduction. Okay, so let's go to obligations and contract, Article 1156. So this is quite a short article, but it has a lot of explanation or annotation. So Article 1156 states the very definition of an obligation. Now, an obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. So that is the basic definition of an obligation. So what are the elements of an obligation? So the elements of an obligation, there must be a obligor. Obligor is the debtor. The obligor is the person who does the obligation. That is the person who does the obligation. That is the obligor. And then we have the obligee or the creditor. The creditor has the right to demand the fulfillment of the obligation. So he is the receiver of the obligation to be fulfilled by the obligor. And then we have the object. Of course, there's always an object of an obligation. It may be a fact, a prestation, or a service. Why? Because it's an obligation to give, to do, or not to do. So when it's an obligation to give, it's either you give a certain object. When it's an obligation to do, you do a certain service. Or obligation not to do, which is it consists of not doing a certain thing. So these are objects of an obligation. And then the juridical tie, or the vinculum juris. It is the relation between the passive subject and the active subject, or it is the relation between the obligor and the creditor. Because again, we say that obligation is a juridical necessity, meaning you are obliged by law to give, to do, or not to do. Okay. However, there are two kinds of obligation. The obligation to give, which is a real obligation, and an obligation to do or not to do, which is a personal obligation. Okay. Now, real obligation, or the obligation to give, that is the obligation of the obligor or the debtor to deliver a thing, movable or immovable, to the creditor for the purpose of transferring ownership or for the use or possession of the recipient. So, we now come into the law on property. Now, you give a movable or immovable thing. Now, because there are two kinds of real obligations. We have the determinate or specific real obligation and the indeterminate or generic real obligation. Now, what do you mean by a determinate or specific real obligation? The obligation of the debtor is to deliver a determinate or a specific thing. So when you say a specific thing, that is the obligation. For example, A has the obligation to deliver an iPhone 12X with serial number XXX555. That is a specific real obligation, because you have to deliver a specific thing. Now, when you say a generic obligation, that is the obligation to deliver an indeterminate or generic thing. The obligation to deliver a cell phone. Now, the cell phone is a generic thing. You can either deliver any kind of cell phone. You compare that to a specific real obligation where you have to deliver a cell phone, an iPhone 12 with serial number XXX555. So, those are the two kinds of real obligation. Now, let's go to a personal obligation. So, when you say it's a personal obligation, there is an obligation to do or not to do. So, the positive personal obligation, obviously, that is your obligation to do. The obligation to paint the house of Mr. X. So, that is an obligation to do. Now, while a negative personal obligation, that is the obligation not to do. The obligation not to construct a fence in front, for example. So, because there are times when you are not allowed to construct a fence because it would impede the passage of other people and the right of way. So, that is an example of a negative personal obligation. Okay, so basically, again, that is an obligation, a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. Okay, now let's go to Article 1157. It states there the sources of obligation. Where does obligation arise? So there are 5 under Article 1157. 57. There are 5 sources of obligation. We have the law, we have contracts, we have quasi-contracts, we have acts or omissions punished by law, and we have quasi-delicts or quasi-delicts. So what is a law? No, basically, a law is a rule of conduct, just, obligatory, promulgated by legitimate authority, and common observance of benefit. So, for example, a common obligation of all Filipino citizens is the obligation to pay taxes, right? Because taxes is the lifeblood of the state. So all citizens are demanded by law or are obliged by law to pay their taxes. So that is an example of an obligation emanating from law. Okay. Now, what is a contract? No, contract, although that is part 2, but being a source of an obligation, we define a contract as a meeting of the minds between two persons, whereby one binds himself with respect to another to give something or to render some service. No, to give something or to render some service, meeting of the minds. So I know, basically, when you talk about contracts, all you imagine is the paper. No, paperwork, documents, no document, no contract, no paper, no contract. But basically, the law actually defines a contract as the meeting of the minds. Not really. A contract is a document of meeting of the minds. No, it does not. The law does not state that. So it's actually the meeting of the minds, where two persons have agreed, agreed to give something or to render service. Then a contract arises and an obligation arises. Okay, so there are 3 stages of a contract. Let's just run through this, although we will go back to the stages of a contract when we talk about contracts. So we have the negotiation. The negotiation is the period wherein the parties try to negotiate the terms of the contract. And then the perfection. The perfection is the meeting of the minds, when the two parties have actually agreed. That is the meeting of the minds. Have agreed to bind themselves to the said agreement or contract. And lastly is the consummation. So when you consummate the contract, this is the part where you do your obligation. What is demanded of you from the contract. So that is another source of obligation, a contract. So we have the law, we have the contract. Third, we have a quasi-contract, 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 or whatever you want to read it. So when you say quasi, as if, mura, parang contract. So a quasi-contract, it's actually not a contract because there is no meeting of the minds between two persons, but only one person binds himself to the said contract. So, a quasi-contract is a certain lawful, voluntary, and unilateral act which gives rise to a juridical relation. So, unilateral. Unlike contracts, there is meeting of the minds between two parties. However, in a quasi-contract, there is only a unilateral act, which such act gives rise to the juridical tie. So, actually, the law only provides to nominate quasi-contracts. When we say nominate, quasi-contract has a name, and there are other quasi-contracts provided by law. Now, what are these two quasi-contracts? We have negotiarum gestio and solutio indebiti. So, negotiarum gestio is when a person voluntarily takes charge of the management of a business or property without the authority from the owner. Without the authority from the owner, and because of such taking over business prospered. No, the business prospered. So, when the owner comes back, the owner now has a quasi-contract with a negosyorum gesture, with a gestor. Now, the owner now has the obligation to repay the gestor with with all that he has done for the business. Now, with all that he has done for the business. Actually, quasi-contracts is anchored on the principle of unjust enrichment. So, what is unjust enrichment? That you are enriched at the expense of another person unjustly. So, because of the principle of unjust enrichment, wherein you are benefited by the actions of another, the principle of quasi-contracts arose. So, again, the principle of negosyorum gesture, the business owner abandoned his business or his property. Now, there comes this person who took pity of the business or who took pity of the property, and he decided to cultivate it even without the permission or the authority of the owner. Now, when the owner comes back and he sees his property or his business prospering, generally, he would want to have it back. But before getting back the property or the business, he must pay. He must pay the person who took care of the said property or business, even if he did not ask that person to do so. So that is a negosyorum gesture. Now, another kind of quasi-contract is solutio indebiti. Solutio indebiti is actually when a person receives something and he has no right to demand it, and it was delivered through mistake, there is an obligation to return. As simple as that, no? So, when you try to look at the law, it's actually common sense clothed in formal language. So, it's just as simple as that. When you receive something which is not for you, and it was delivered to you by mistake, then you have to return it back. That is the principle of solutio indebiti, a quasi-contract. When you receive something that is not for you, that you have the obligation to return it back. That is a quasi-contract. The obligation to return arises from the time you receive a thing that is not for you. For example, you received a 500 peso load, and you know that you did not buy such load. Now, someone here texts you that please return my load, even if you just return it at 400 pesos. And then, what is the right thing to do? Now, under the principle of solutio indebiti, you have the obligation to return it because it was only delivered to you by mistake. Okay, so that those are quasi-contracts. Again, why is it quasi or quasi? Because the unilateral act of a person gives rise to a juridical relation compared to a contract where there is meeting of the minds, wherein the two parties agreed. However, in a quasi-contract, only one party agreed where such act of the said party gave rise to a obligation. Okay. And then the fourth source of obligation, that is a delict, acts or omissions punished by law, or what we commonly know as delict, or in layman's language, a crime. Okay. So, a delict, it is a violation of law. It's a wrongful act or omission giving rise to a claim for compensation. So, we all know in criminal cases, there's always the term damages. You have to pay for damages. There's always compensation. There's always money involved. Why? Because a crime, a delict, is a source of obligation. Now, under the revised penal code, the revised penal code is our law on crimes. That's our law on crimes. So, under the revised penal code, Article 100, every person criminally liable is civilly liable. Now, if the court of laws adjudged you as guilty of a crime, not you are not just punished to imprisonment, but you also have to pay compensation. Okay, so what do you have to pay in what are the civil liabilities? What are your obligations when you commit a delict? So aside from being punished from the crime, you have your civil liabilities. So you have restitution. So you can do restitution when it is possible. So when you say restitution, you have to return the thing itself. For example, in a case of robbery, you stole 1 million worth of jewelry. You can restitute. You can have restitution when you still have the jewelry, the exact jewelry that you stole. So that is your civil liability. Aside from imprisonment, you will have to restitute. You have to return what you stole. However, for example, your crime cannot be restituted. There can be no way for restitution. For example, in the crime of murder, how do you restitute? How do you bring back a person's life in case of murder? So, of course, you do not bring back a person's life, but you give reparation to the damage. No, it could be we have the life indemnification, a certain price for taking a life of a person. No, for example, so you have to pay. Or for example, in cases of robbery, you stole, again, let's go back to the 1 million worth of jewelry. However, you already sold the jewelry, so you can no longer restitute the proper party or the owner. So what you have to do, you have to pay for the value of the thing. That is reparation of the damage caused. You have to pay for the price of the said thing. And then we have indemnification for the consequential damages. So this includes what was suffered by the family because of the crime you have committed. So we have mental damages. Mental is moral, exemplary, nominal, temperate, actual, and liquidated damages. Mental, we will talk about that later on the later part. So you have to pay for moral damages. So again, a person criminally liable is civilly liable. And lastly, we have quasi-delicts. Now, quasi-delicts, why is it quasi? As if delict? Because you are not criminal, you did not intend to commit such criminal act. No, so the act or omission which caused damage to another was not because of your criminal intent, but because of fault or negligence. So what is the most common criminal act? Quasi-delict. And the most common quasi-delict or quasi-ex delicto is reckless imprudence resulting to either damage to property, resulting to physical injuries, resulting to homicide. So, why is it quasi-delict? Because you did not actually intend to kill the person, but because of your recklessness, because of your negligence, the crime was committed. And as we have said a while ago, a person criminally liable is also civilly liable. It also applies in quasi-delict. So aside from the fact that you have to be imprisoned because of your criminal liability, you are also civilly liable. Okay. So under quasi-delicts, it states there three kinds of negligence. So we have culpa achilliana, which is a quasi-delict. That is the negligence resulting from the failure to observe the required diligence which causes damage to another person. And then we have culpa contractual. That is negligence in the performance of a pre-existing contract. Now, culpa achilliana and culpa contractual, these are civil negligence, while culpa criminal is a criminal negligence. Okay. So, again, under 1157, the sources. Now, the sources of an obligation are laws, contracts, quasi-contracts, delicts, and quasi-delicts. Now, Article 1158 states there that obligations derived from law are not presumed. So, it means that what is only expressly provided by law, those are the only demandable obligations. If the obligation is not expressly provided by law, then they are not deemed demandable at once, except if it is provided under this book, the Civil Code. Now we have Article 1159. Article 1159 states that obligations arising from contracts have the force of law between the contracting parties and should be complied with in good faith. Article 1159 states that obligations arising from contracts have the force of law between contracting parties and should be complied with in good faith. So it only means that contracts, whether it is written or verbally made, it is the law between the two contracting parties, and it should be followed and must be complied with always in good faith. So that is 1159. Although we can expand that later when we talk about contracts. Now, Article 1160 states that obligations derived from quasi-contracts shall be subject to the provisions of Chapter 1 of Title 17 of this book. So, actually, quasi-contract is not covered by Book 4, Law on Obligations and Contract. It is covered by a different part of the Civil Code. So, although the book enumerates numerous examples of the kinds of quasi-contracts, so you may read it for better understanding. 1161 states that civil obligations arising from criminal offenses shall be governed by penal laws, subject to the provisions of Article 2177 and of the prudent provisions of Chapter 2 Preliminary Title on Human Relations and of Title 18 of this book regulating damages. Basically, it also states that civil liabilities arising from delicts is also not covered by this part of the book, Book 4. And then Article 1162 states that obligations derived from quasi-delicts shall be governed by the provisions of Chapter 2, Title 7 of this book and by special law. So we also have a different law covering quasi-delict. Now, if you try to look at the sources of law, sources of obligation, what is only covered by this subject is obligations arising from contracts. So that is why we have obligations and contracts. So that ends Chapter 1, the general provisions of obligations. Thank you.